Good afternoon, and welcome to those tuning in here in Washington and around the world. I'm Charles Edel, the Australia Chair and Senior Advisor here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The Australia Chair at CSIS, endowed through the generosity of Pratt Industries, is dedicated to increasing understanding between the United States and Australia and serving as an independent platform to pursue policy changes that strengthen bilateral ties. In that vein, I'm very excited to today launch a new CSIS report, Growing Challenges, Rising Ambitions, Ausmin 2022 and Expanding U.S. Australian Cooperation. Now, while this report was written in advance of Ausmin's meeting on December 6th, the report is intended to help raise the ambitions of the conversations between Washington and Canberra and suggest multiple ways to generate more creative and forward-leaning policies. A little bit of context up front. In September of 2021, President Joe Biden declared that the United States has no closer or more reliable ally than Australia. The U.S. National Security Coordinator on the Indo-Pacific region, Kurt Campbell, went a step further in his comments as we launched the Australia Chair here at CSIS, declaring that moving forward, everything we do of consequence in the Indo-Pacific, we will do with Australia. Such sentiments are indicative not only of how critical the alliance between Australia and the U.S. has become, but also that the alliance is entering into a transformational period that has the potential to reinvent how Washington thinks about its relationship with one of its most trusted allies. On Tuesday, December 6th, that's next week, the U.S. Secretary of State and Defense will host their Australian counterparts, the Australian Ministers for Foreign Affairs and Defense, for the 32nd iteration of Ausmin. Ausmin has been held nearly every year since 1985, and it alternates between the United States and Australia. When Antony Blinken, Lloyd Austin, Penny Wong, and Richard Marles meet here in Washington, they will exchange views on regional and global developments, discuss strategies for how to respond to those developments, and consider how to deepen bilateral cooperation in their foreign, defense, and economic policies. As the stakes have increased and cooperation has deepened, so too has the urgency to define a more comprehensive and robust agenda. The CSIS report that we're releasing today, which you can read on our website, sets out to examine where that cooperation could lead. It draws from 22 leading experts who in individual essays discuss how Washington and Canberra can elevate, sharpen, and advance U.S.-Australian relations. The essays range across a wide swath of areas, from the economic to the technological, diplomatic, developmental, and defense topics, and cover such issues as improving the efficacy of development assistance, bolstering supply chain resilience, offsetting economic coercion, enhancing clean energy cooperation, and expanding diplomatic ventures with Japan, South Korea, India, and Taiwan. The essays describe the state of play on each topic, frame the most important questions and challenges, and lay out practical recommendations for advancing the alliance. Now, while these essays and the recommendations that they contain are narrowly constructed around particular ways that the alliance might evolve, they also highlight the need to increase the capacity of both countries to do more in the Indo-Pacific. As CSIS's own Rick Rosso notes in his essay, Ausmin is a bilateral meeting, but its outcomes have implications on the evolving Indo-Pacific architecture, both for adversaries and for allies and partners closely watching whether and how quickly this key relationship can develop. Perhaps the best thing about working at a place like CSIS is the extraordinary range, talent, and wisdom of my colleagues. I'm looking at them right now. I sought to harness that expertise with this report, yes, to help form the deliberations for Ausmin next week, but also to go beyond that and raise ambitions for what has already become quite an ambitious relationship. I think this report does just that, the result being more than 70 policy recommendations that address the most crucial challenges facing the alliance. The recommendations themselves are not necessarily consensus viewpoints, but rather the suggested approach put forth by individual contributors. Now, I'd like to have all 22 authors here on the screen to discuss their essays, but that's probably a bridge too far for technological capabilities. Instead, I've asked 4 of our contributors, Matt Goodman, Kelsey Hartigan, Mick Ryan, and Seyoon Ji, to discuss their essays and to give a flavor of the broad range of recommendations that we have. Let me introduce our speakers and their topics before diving into the report itself. First, discussing trade and economics, Matthew Goodman is Senior Vice President for Economics at CSIS. Before joining CSIS in 2012, Matt served as Director for International Economics on the National Security Council staff, helping the President prepare for global and regional summits, including the G20, APEC, and the East Asia summits. He also served in senior roles at the State Department and Treasury, as well as working in the private sector at Albright, Stonebridge Group, and Goldman Sachs. To talk about nuclear stewardship, we have Kelsey Hartigan, the Deputy Director of the Project on Nuclear Issues and Senior Fellow with the International Security Program at CSIS. Prior to joining CSIS, Kelsey was dual-hatted as a faculty associate at the Naval Postgraduate School and a senior advisor for the Director of the U.S. Special Operations Command Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate. From 2016 to 2019, she served as a policy advisor on weapons of mass destruction, crisis response planning, and nuclear proliferation in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. Mick Ryan, who's beaming in from Australia, is a retired Major General in the Australian Army, and he wrote a terrific piece on joint planning and the future of war. He has commanded at the platoon, squadron, regiment, task force, and brigade level, and ran the Australian Defence College. Mick was made a member of the Order of Australia and completed his 35-year career with the Australian Army and transitioned to the Army Reserve as a Major General in February 2022, the same month in which his book, War Transform, was published by the U.S. Naval Institute Books. I hasten to add that he's an adjunct fellow of the Australia Chair at CSIS. Finally, I'm privileged to introduce Se-Yoon Ji, a research associate with the Korea Chair here at CSIS, to discuss U.S. Australian collaboration with South Korea. Se-Yoon focuses on projects involving the U.S.-ROC alliance, inter-Korean relations, and North Korea. Prior to joining CSIS, she was a research assistant at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. Okay, that was a long wind-up. Let's get into it. Matt, ANZUS, the security treaty between the United States and Australia, is now into its 7th decade. At the start of your essay, you opened by saying, surely if ANZUS were written today, it would surely include an article for economic cooperation. Can you explain a little bit why that's a necessary addition to the way that ANZUS was formulated in the first place, and also what it might look like?
Sure. Well, thanks, Charlie, and thanks for having me, and congratulations on a terrific report. Really interesting essays, even outside the economic realm, which is an achievement. That's great. Well, I thought you might ask me that, so I actually came prepared with a treaty that the U.S. agreed to a few years later after ANZUS with Japan, and in Article 2, not Article 22, Article 2 of that treaty. It says, and I'll read it exactly, that the parties, meaning U.S. and Japan, will seek to eliminate conflict in their international economic policies and will encourage economic collaboration between them. Now, that was after a statement about supporting free institutions and promoting principles and norms in the international system. So economics is at the heart of the U.S.-Japan treaty, and I think it would be, if ANZUS had been written a few years later, probably would have been included, and should be today, in any case, a central part of the U.S. Australia alliance. As I said in my paper, the U.S. and Australia share this common interest in responding to the challenge of a rising China, frankly. I mean, we obviously have other challenges in the world, but China is a challenge for us economically because it is using its power and influence to both coerce and induce countries in the Indo-Pacific and beyond to follow their preferred rules and norms. And it is also directing massive state resources towards developing its own industries and technologies, many of which have applications not only in the economic sphere, but also in the military realm, and that is of serious concern to both of us. So we have a stake in responding to this challenge. And as I said in my short paper, we need to push back where China is not following the rules. We need to promote new rules where those don't exist, like in the digital space. We need to develop resilient supply chains. We need to offer positive incentives to developing countries to follow our preferred rules and norms. So that's the thrust of what I was trying to get to in my paper.
Would you mind if I asked you to lay out some of the recommendations that might help to push that along?
Sure. I mean, there's so many things that we are doing together in the economic realm and could do more. So I just highlighted a few. These are not exhaustive, but I would say one thing is I think we need to make the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which we are both parties of. It's the Biden administration's initiative, but Australia is now a full member of the so-called IPEF initiative. We need to make that succeed because the U.S. is not ready to rejoin a traditional trade agreement like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And this is what they're offering as an approach to economic engagement with the region. And I think there's a long agenda. It's not a bad list of issues, but I think in particular there are 3 areas in IPEF that I think the U.S. and Australia should be working on. Promoting digital rules, our preferred approach to the digital economy. We should be promoting the supply chain piece of IPEF, and particularly finding ways to incentivize countries to make their supply chains more resilient, or they're part of the global supply chain more resilient, and then to promote clean energy solutions and sustainable infrastructure. I think that part of IPEF is very powerful, and we have a lot to offer. I also think in a sort of related way, a second recommendation is that we should increase our aid budgets. We both spend a lot on aid, but we need to do that. We need to do more, and we need to use that to build capacity in these areas and others around the Indo-Pacific region. And in that context, I have a separate recommendation, but on reflection, it really is all part of the same recommendation about working hand in glove with Japan on these issues, because Japan is also very similarly aligned on these issues, has great capabilities and great tools of development and other support. I know there are other papers in the report on that. I also think we should work together on critical minerals, a key part of the supply chain. I know there's also, I think, separate references to those throughout the report. We should map these supply chains, where these minerals come from, how they're traded, where they're processed, and then have sort of more incentives to shift production, frankly, away from China and towards other places, including our own countries. And then I think we need to work together on coercion, finally. Australia has been one of
countering coercion.
Countering coercion.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Countering coercion, right. Australia has been one of the latest victims of this phenomenon where China uses these sort of informal means of expressing its unhappiness with some alleged violation of Chinese interests. And so we, I think, need to try and mobilize a group of countries that aren't going to allow that to continue to happen. We are actually shameless self-advertising. The economics program is working on a big report on economic coercion that'll be out by March 1, in which we're trying to develop a kind of policy framework for how to do that. And just to not be a spoiler, but the last thing I'll say is we went into this thinking that the best way to deter China is to threaten punishment in response. That's a piece of the story. Yeah. We actually increasingly drawn to the notion of trying to deter them by denying them and deflecting them from their efforts, by making countries more resilient, by helping them find new markets if they get coerced. So stay tuned for the full details.
I know, I can't wait to see that. It's really good that you flagged the aid and the Japan angle and the critical minerals angle. I mean, look, as I said, we just have a sampling of what's in this report, but there are 18 individual essays, and there are 2 on development, both of which talk about not only bolstering aid budgets, working much more closely with other partners like South Korea, like Japan, but also making sure that our systems are meshed better than they are right now. Look, we started off the conversation, Matt, by talking about the last couple of decades and revisions that we might make, but really the last year has seen one major revision, right, which is the advent of AUKUS coming in, right? The partnership between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom to both kind of enmesh defense innovation, but also to bolster the defense capabilities of Australia, and much more narrowly, to ensure that they have nuclear propulsion in submarines and bringing them online. And this is, we should say, new territory for Australia. They have no nuclear-capable platforms, certainly no nuclear-capable submarines, and you wrote a terrific piece together with Heather Williams on the issue of, narrowly the issue of nuclear stewardship, but it scopes a lot more broadly than that. And I'm hoping that you might start us off, Kelsey, by talking about what this actually means. What does entering this new domain of nuclear stewardship, which Australia has not been a player in before, mean for Australia, mean for the alliance, but also a little bit more broadly about what it might mean for regional diplomacy around the region as well?
Well, Charlie, thanks again for the invitation to be here today, but also to contribute to this great report. Like Matt said, I think it's a phenomenal product, and it's really cool to see all the expertise around CSIS contribute to that. So I also want to acknowledge Dr. Heather Williams, as you said, a co-author for this. She's in Boston today, so you guys are stuck with me for today. But as you said, the decision to share naval nuclear propulsion technology, that is a really big deal, and this really will be a massive undertaking for Australia. So one of the things that we tried to do in our paper, we looked at the kind of AUKUS specific piece, but a few kind of broader nuclear dynamics for the alliance more specifically as well. And right now there are a number of different task forces that are looking at all the different requirements that go along with nuclear stewardship. So how do you safely operate a nuclear reactor? How do you think about workforce and capacity requirements to regulate and maintain this type of program? There's a lot that goes along with that, and those details will be really important to get right. But I think there's also another piece of that, which is the non-proliferation and the safeguards aspect of this, and that's an area where we focus, because this is absolutely new and uncharted territory, and so I think we have seen a commitment from all three countries as this partnership moves forward to uphold the highest non-proliferation standards, but of course the specific details of how all of this will work in practice, we just don't know a lot of information yet, and that is we've been kind of in this 18-month period where we're expecting in March to know a lot more details.
So just to make sure, this 18-month period where the three governments are figuring out the optimal pathway forward for AUKUS, and the report is due out in March 2023. Sorry.
Yes. No. Thank you for translating that. We I think so many folks are eagerly awaiting some of those details that I think we've kind of been a little bit in limbo, and so really trying to kind of understand the non-proliferation impact of this, and how do you make sure that this arrangement sets a really strong precedent going forward. I think one way that's kind of useful to think about this is, I will say at the outset, I am not concerned about Australia acquiring nuclear weapons through this arrangement. I think that we should just take that off the table. But the piece that is important is making sure that the safeguards arrangement that will go along with this deal, that the precedent that sets for other countries who could follow suit and go down this path and pursue their own nuclear propulsion program, that precedent that's being set is ironclad, and that we are comfortable with the verification arrangements that would go along with that. So again, the difficulty here is that there are a lot of details that we don't know yet. But one thing we do know is that the Chinese are not big fans of this. I think it's fair to say, and we've seen a lot of disinformation about what the arrangement would entail, and we've seen that particularly at the Non-Proliferation Review Conference in New York a few months ago, and at the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. And I think I've heard some officials describe it as it's kind of like throwing spaghetti against the wall to kind of see what sticks. And I think that's fair, because we've seen accusations about that this is a cover for pursuing nuclear weapons, that this violates the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which are not true. But I think this leads us to one of our core recommendations in the report, which is, you have the State Department, the Global Engagement Center, you have mechanisms within the U.S. government that are designed to counter disinformation. And so I think one thing that would be really helpful as we're kind of in this limbo period is to actually document China's playbook and say, okay, these are the types of narratives, these are the types of tools that we're seeing kind of, and how this disinformation is being spread, and to kind of call them on that. And I think that's something that, the meeting next week, if you can get to those types of kind of practical implementation details, I think that will go a long way in kind of heading off some of the broader disinformation that we're seeing as we await the kind of final details of what the broader kind of AUKUS, the nuclear propulsion piece will entail.
Huh. I'm going to ask Mick about the lessons of the war in Ukraine, but you've kind of put that on the table already, right? Because one of the things that we saw in the playbook, at least on the Allied side of the playbook, was that we can do information operations by reading the disinformation operations and exposing it ahead of time. And it's a really interesting recommendation that we be a little bit more public about what the Chinese in particular are doing on the disinformation realm, on what this is, AUKUS, and what it is clearly not, even if they try to make it. Can I just ask one follow-up question
please.
about this? So this is your report. If you guys read it, I recommend that everyone read the report, but the whole report, but talks about individual efforts that both Australia and the U.S. can take on combating the disinformation, the spaghetti that's being thrown at the wall. What is that? So you talked about what Australia can do, what the United States can do, the Global Engagement Center. What does that look like in terms of regional diplomacy? Is there a more forward-leaning approach that the United States needs to take, that Australia needs to take in discussing what is happening with our partners in Southeast Asia in particular?
Yeah, so I think when we saw the original announcement, I think again there was, as we were saying earlier, there was this big push to kind of say from the outset that there will be really stringent non-proliferation standards that will go along with that. But I think in some ways there's been a little bit of kind of feeling like you're on the back of your foot. In a little bit of a defensive position, trying to kind of claw back the narrative, and so I think that's when we talk about within the nuclear space, there's the NPT, sometimes described as a loophole that would allow this type of activity to take place, and I think that's one narrative, but the other way to look at this is that the NPT allows states to pursue naval nuclear propulsion programs and to use nuclear material for those programs. And so I think, because we don't have the specific verification measures that will go along, because no one has done that, because those mechanisms don't exist, this is actually an opportunity to set that really strong precedent and actually strengthen key aspects of the NPT. So that's a different way to look at it, and that is decisively not the narrative that China and others have put forward. But I think, again, if you can really start to kind of show that playbook and have something to reference back to, it makes it a little bit easier to explain to people that this is actually an opportunity here.
I like that recommendation very much, that you're not only showing their playbook but also helping to write the new playbook and the new rules. I mean, different than what we're talking about in the economic space, but as we move into uncharted territory, making sure that the rules are clear and transparent and followed. We were talking about Ukraine, or at least I was talking about Ukraine, and we were talking about nuclear stewardship, which puts us clearly in the realm of strategic discussion. And Mick, almost overnight, I say this, you've done retirement really poorly because you've become super busy post-retirement. You're not really retired, and have become actually one of the world's leading go-to sources on a daily basis about what's happening in the war in Ukraine. Everything from the tactical to the operational to the leadership to the strategic angle. And really, a lot of your posts, a lot of the articles that you're writing, I think are pushing us to not only observe more closely what's happening, but also to think about what lessons that we should be pulling out of that. And so in your essay, which kind of kicks off our section on defense cooperation, I find it a really interesting starting point that you talk a bit about the future of war, what we're learning from this conflict, but also then apply that much more directly to what Australia and the United States should take jointly from this and which areas this should push them into that they haven't yet gone. And I just hope that you might actually give us a broad opening here for what lessons you think we should be pulling out. We're now many months into this war, and what this actually means for both the U.S. and Australia jointly.
Well, thanks, Charles. It's great to be with you all here today, and congratulations to you and all the other authors on what is a very fine report indeed, and one that is very timely. And given the timing of Ausmin, the recently released DoD report on China and the PLA and the events that we're seeing in Ukraine, there are a lot of opportunities for us to watch and reflect and then apply lessons to the U.S. Australia relationship. And if I was to characterise the big strategic lessons from what we've seen over the last 10 months in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I mean, the big one is that good strategy matters. I mean, essentially, that's what we're here talking about today. Thoughtful strategy that's founded on realistic and tested assumptions is something that we all must take great care to nurture in our strategic communities, and that includes diplomats, military, government, academia, economists, a whole bunch of different people across our strategic communities. And it's something where the Russians deeply, deeply failed at. I mean, it was a very narrowly conceived invasion. It may have had some chance of success at the beginning, as some recent reports have postulated, but essentially the Russians went into this war with a bad strategy founded on some assumptions that were demonstrably wrong around Ukrainian nationhood, around the capacity of the Ukrainian military and the ability of the West to support Ukraine. So I think that is a major takeaway from this war that is very relevant to both our nations and the future of security in the Indo-Pacific. I think a second really important lesson is the nature of deterrence. It really concerns me, particularly in my own country, that we don't really have a theory of deterrence for a middle power that doesn't have nuclear weapons. And if you have a look at Ukraine, it gave up its weapons, nuclear weapons, in the wake of the Cold War in return for certain guarantees and obligations from Europe and the United States. And you've got to think that a lot of countries will be looking at that, whether that was a wise decision. Be that as it may, there's lots of middle powers in the Indo-Pacific without nuclear weapons who will be looking at how do we deter Chinese aggression with conventional weapons and other elements of national power. And I think there's a lot more thinking to be done there. We talk about countering Chinese coercion and information warfare, influence operations are part of that, but demonstrable efforts by diplomats, by military, by economic people will all be, I think, critical elements of what might be a middle power deterrence theory for countries without nuclear weapons. And I think another takeaway, and I think a really important part of this relationship moving forward, is strategic resilience. So we've talked about a few elements of that already, whether it's minerals, whether it's the ability to counter coercion and influence against our political systems. But I think resilience is a far broader and deeper undertaking for both our countries individually, but also together. And whether that includes reinvigorating our capacity for civil defence, I think that's important, whether it's reinvigorating our defence industry so we can do things at both scale and also in a dispersed manner so they're survivable. And, you know, it will also encompass things like communications and transportation networks. So these, I think, are three really important takeaways from the war in Ukraine that are very relevant in a different way, but just as relevant to this relationship, but also the future of security in the Western Pacific.
One of the more interesting recommendations, look, it's music to the ears of a think tank or of an academic when you propose to have a study. But you actually have a very pointed study that you propose that we jointly undertake as countries, right? The recommendation is a joint commission to undertake a rapid, in-depth studies of the lessons learned from Ukraine, because they really span the gamut here. You know, as someone who's had a lot of experience writing commission reports yourself, can you talk about, one, the feasibility of something like that, and what actually, if it does come off, you would hope it might yield for both countries?
Well, I think we need a common view on what are the real lessons from this war that are applicable outside of the Ukrainian context. I mean, not every lesson is applicable to the Indo-Pacific, and deciding which ones are, I think, is a very important undertaking. But at the same time, we don't have a lot of time. This isn't something that can be a 2 or 3 or 5 year undertaking, as governments are wont to do. I mean, we have a very short amount of time to make informed judgments, which won't be risk-free. There will be certain amounts of risk with all the judgments, but informed judgments about capabilities, about warfighting concepts, about national capabilities beyond the military realm that we might need and might be useful in firstly deterring Chinese aggression in the Western Pacific in particular, but also responding if the Chinese do make some kind of catastrophic miscalculation about Western intent and capability to respond to some future military operation. I'm sure we'll talk about that in the context of Taiwan. So, we can do these things quickly if we really want to, and we can act quickly if the imperative is there. And I think meetings like Ausmin can provide those kind of imperatives, but the environments change. We don't have the time that we had, say, 10 years ago to ponder the big implications of certain events. We have to move on with things more quickly, and we need to take more risk in developing our strategies for how we're going to deal with China across the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. The idea of developing a higher threshold for risk tolerance runs throughout these essays, and as does Taiwan. I mean, there's an explicit essay that Lavina Lee has written on Taiwan. I know you discuss it, but also runs through our essays on Japan and our essay on South Korea. Seon, the terrific essay that you and Victor Cha wrote together, which is, Ausmin is a bilateral, right? It's Australia and the U.S., so where comes South Korea? Well, the point is, maybe we have to get a little bit more ambitious about how we can partner with other parties to this. And you opened that essay with a really interesting and quite pointed, if I may, reference that I'd like to read for everyone here. Australia and South Korea are alike in their twofold challenge of navigating security partnerships with the United States while managing heavy trade reliance on China, particularly at a time of intensifying U.S.-China strategic rivalry. Moreover, a heavy economic dependence on China has made South Korea and Australia especially vulnerable to Beijing's targeted economic coercion practices, something that Matt was talking about. What I find, though, really interesting is there's a but here, which you guys explore. Canberra and Seoul have reacted differently to a similar set of challenges. I'm hoping that you could talk a little bit about the differences in how the two countries have responded, and also what this might mean, what this could portend for closer U.S.-Australian work with South Korea.
Thank you, Dr. Edel, and thank you, Lam. While Dr. Cha couldn't join today because he's traveling in Seoul, he and I are very grateful for the opportunity to contribute to a very timely report, which not only comes ahead of the 32nd Ausmin consultations, but next year, South Korea and Australia are also hosting their 6 2+2 ministerial meetings, and so it'll be particularly timely for that. The policy recommendations that we've laid out in our paper are very ambitious, but they aim to broaden and deepen a regional security architecture that underpins the goals of the U.S.-Australia alliance. These recommendations also build on and challenge Australia and South Korea's existing strong bilateral relationship. They are both comprehensive strategic partners that have shared democratic values, regional strategic interests, alliances with the United States, and very highly complementary economies. And like you mentioned, they also share this challenge of having to navigate a security partnership with the United States while managing a very heavy trade reliance on China that's made them very vulnerable to its targeted economic coercion practices. Where Australia and South Korea have diverged is in their different responses to Chinese coercion. While Australia has responded by strengthening regional alliances and forming Chinese-facing security partnerships like the AUKUS and the Quad, the South Korean government under former President Moon has responded largely by distancing itself from regional alliances, whether that's by committing to what's known as the 3 no's in response to Seoul's decision to host the THAAD missile defense system, as well as the Moon administration preempting an invitation by the Biden administration to join the Quad. And these are just a few of many other examples where Australia and South Korea have clearly taken very different policy approaches to China. The response to China's rise by the U.S.-Australia alliance, we argue, has been exemplary among like-minded partners that are balancing different economic and security equities. And this alliance can broaden its scope by taking on greater regional roles, as exemplified by the U.S., Australia, Japan trilateral security dialogue and the Australia-Japan bilateral security declaration. And so one of the recommendations that we laid out was to model Australia-South Korea security declaration on the one between Australia and Japan. On the economic front, Australia and South Korea should establish a senior bilateral working group or a trilateral one, including the United States, to consult on diversifying trade partners and bolstering supply chain resilience, particularly in response to Chinese economic coercion practices in the region. This could also be a useful platform for Australia to share with South Korea its experiences on how to blunt Chinese coercion. And the Yoon administration's support for the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific economic strategy, the mineral security partnership, the Chip 4 alliance, these are all very important and welcome developments for these kinds of efforts. We also support greater alignment of Australian and South Korean strategies on official development assistance to enhance democratic partnerships and values in the region. So I'll wrap up by saying that while we recognize that this is a very ambitious agenda, encouraging and supporting South Korea to join these like-minded initiatives would provide a significant boost to U.S. Australia efforts to support the liberal international order in the region. And the new governments in South Korea and Canberra offer a really important opportunity to do this. In fact, we're already seeing that the new South Korean government under President Yoon is very eager to move away from this policy of strategic ambiguity on China to strategic clarity, to tighten alliances with the United States and other regional partners, and to play a more active role in multilateral and minilateral mechanisms in the region. And so I'll stop here. I look forward to the discussion, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Well, thanks, but you don't get to stop here because I have questions for you. No, it's your essay along with the other essays. They're short essays. They're very readable and digestible, but they have like a world of recommendations. As you said, it is quite ambitious. It's an entirely different way to think about how we integrate South Korea more closely into the emerging architecture. And I really want to pick up on one of the things that you said with the new administration in Seoul. And I'm curious if you could actually just give us a perspective on the likely receptivity of, again, yes, they want to do more. Yes, there's now been an Indo-Pacific strategy that's been released by Seoul. What's your temperature taking for the more ambitious efforts, some of which you guys outline here in Seoul?
Yeah. So President Yoon, since his candidacy, has been unequivocal in advocating for the centrality of the U.S. South Korea alliance as a key feature of its foreign policy. And the foreign policy vision that President Yoon laid out is something called the global pivotal state. And it's this vision for playing a greater role, not just in the Korean Peninsula, but in addressing global challenges. And so while there are sort of domestic setbacks, North Korea has been on a flurry of missile testing just the second half of 2022 alone. President Yoon also won by the narrowest margin in South Korea's democratic history, and so he's going to have to rally the opposition party who holds the majority in the parliament. Despite that, there seems to be widespread bipartisan support for South Korea to play this global pivotal role. His desire for improved relations with not just the United States, but with Japan as well and other regional partners, I think will provide a really significant impetus for him to achieve his foreign policy vision.
That's a very optimistic take, and I'm glad to hear it. Look, actually, when we stay on this, we have a lot of expertise here, not only on South Korea, but on Japan, Matt, on the broader region. And I actually want to ask a question about opportunity costs. If you flip through the report, we kick it off with discussing regional diplomacy, which is, again, this is a bilateral meeting between Australia and the U.S., and yet we have like 6 essays here recommending how we better include other partners within the U.S.-Australian relationship. And I think that there's an unspoken assumption that most of the authors have here that if you work to more actively include other partners, whether it's Japan, whether it's South Korea, if it's France, if it's the Philippines, that the sum total, the total sum, I guess we should probably say, of our efforts are likely to be more robust and more effective. And again, I did want to ask an opportunity cost type of question. At what cost to efficiency and trust do we get when we begin to expand the pool of who we're coordinating with? Matt, if you don't mind, I'll start with you, and then everyone should feel free to jump in here.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, first of all, let me say you only gave us 500 words, so we weren't able to elaborate on some things. For example, I didn't say enough about Korea's role in the U.S. Australia and Japan context of working on a lot of these issues. Separately, we're doing a lot of work on how U.S. Korea can work together more on economic security writ large. But I do think you're asking an important question. When I used to work on the G20, in the White House, in the Obama White House, the G20 often even the G20 got criticized for not being a legitimate organization because it didn't include everybody in the world, albeit 80% of the world, but not the whole world. And I found myself, as economists do, drawing a little chart, which basically, I'll try and do it backwards, which basically tried to correlate inclusiveness of a group and the number of people you have in it with efficiency of the group. And there's really a downward sloping curve. The more people you have in the room, the harder it is to be efficient. And I tried to say that I think, though, there is a kind of sweet spot in the middle of that curve where you have enough people in the room who have something to offer on a particular subject to be able to then deliver, some tangible benefits and outcome. And that is, efficient enough to produce good outcomes and legitimacy of the process, and others will kind of accept that. And so more specifically in this context, I would say it's sort of horses for courses in my view. There's some things on which we do want 3, 4, 10 people in the room, depending on what the topic is. I would say, for example, the Fab 4 or the Chip 4, but in Korea I learned that people call it the Fab 4, which is wonderful, on of semiconductor countries. I mean, that's pretty obviously U.S., Japan, Korea, the Netherlands, maybe a little bit of Germany, and there are other countries that have something to say about semiconductor production. But, for that purpose, those are the right countries. For something else, it's probably a different group. IPEF is a broader group. I think that's probably appropriate. But I think you need to have the right people in the room who can offer something that is tangible and concrete and creates a sort of legitimacy and efficiency that you're, I think, ultimately getting to. So that's kind of how I look at all this. There's no single grouping of countries that makes sense for every issue.
Anyone else want to jump in on that one? If not, let me just kind of...
I'm happy to jump in on that one quickly.
Jump ahead,
Charles.
Mick.
I think, I think there is a sweet spot, but I think we also need to avoid echo chambers of, just two countries constantly talking at each other. I mean, the superpower of democracies is the ability to generate the most diverse views, the most diverse range of options, and then test them both in development and execution. That's something that the Chinese, the Russians will never be able to do. So I think broadening national security discussions beyond Ausmin and what that looks like, there's a few different models, but I think broadening the conversation is very important for all of us if we're going to come up with the right solutions to some of the really big challenges that are facing us.
Yeah, go ahead, Kelsey.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I mean, in some ways it's not an either or. I think it's a little bit of a yes and so I think trying to find some of those issues within the alliance in particular that you really do have to get right at a bilateral level and get to a more detailed level. One of the areas that we also hit on in our paper is thinking about extended deterrence issues. Mick mentioned deterrence, assurance, those types of kind of broader issues. And that is something I think there is kind of a growing realization that we do need to get to a place bilaterally within the alliance where we can, at a much more detailed level, really start to kind of think through some of the specific mechanisms, make sure we understand decision-making structures, both for China, but also in the event of a North Korea contingency. I think there are some very detailed discussions that need to take place there. And I know, bilaterally, for years, we've been reluctant to even call that, again, from a nuclear perspective, an extended deterrence dialogue.
Right.
So I think, again, making sure that we can get to that place where you do have much more forward-leaning bilateral discussions, that I think really sets the stage and gives you a better platform to go out and engage regional partners if you are really lockstep on the same page at a much more detailed level to be able to go out and, like I said, engage others and bring those into the fold as well.
Yeah, look, so far this is, we're talking about the one-hand clapping approach to strategy, as I say, right? Like what we can do, which is what we should be thinking about. That's how you generate policy creativity. But there's always a response and there's a pushback too. So look, I do, staying for a second on the bilateral relationship, assuming that Australian-U.S. cooperation is going to continue kind of moving up and kind of broadening and deepening how it goes, what type of responses do you think that we should anticipate coming from the other side, and more specifically from Beijing? I mean, you talked about some of what we've seen already, Kelsey, in terms of more disinformation efforts, more disruptive efforts. Should we anticipate, for instance, a resumption of pressure on South Korea, the likes of which we saw, 4 or 5 years ago, if Yoon begins to steer the alliance back toward there? Do you have any thoughts on what we might anticipate from the other side of the ledger?
Yeah, I think for the case of South Korea, that's definitely true. One of the first conversations that China had with South Korea's new foreign minister, Park Jin, was that they expected South Korea to uphold the 3 no's in response to that. That's not joining the U.S. missile defense system, not elevating the U.S. ROK Japan security partnership into an alliance, and no additional deployments. Thankfully, the South Korean foreign minister has responded by saying that that was neither a promise nor a pledge. And so we are already seeing certain degrees of pressure, but the government has been able to respond by keeping the U.S.-Korea alliance at the centerpiece of its foreign policy.
Matt, do you expect like an uptick in economic coercion, or is that proved manifestly counterproductive?
I think that's a possible outcome, and one that we've seen in a lot of issues. I think, though, that I think of it as, China's probably doing a number of things as it looks at these developments. It's doubling down on trying to become more self-sufficient itself, and so you see it investing in its own capabilities, whether in semiconductors or in military affairs. And so I think that's one response from them, which is sort of understandable on one level from their point of view. Another is to try to use on the positive side, kind of diplomacy, things like the Belt and Road Initiative, to try to win friends and influence people. And in the sort of dark side of that, to divide and conquer a little bit the other people we're trying to reach. And then coercion, is going to be, I think, part of this. I think, it has been. So I don't see any reason China's going to stop doing that in response to our continued effort to work with other allies and partners like Australia. So.
Yeah, on the coercion piece and really on the hot button issue, I do want to talk about Taiwan a little bit. It actually weaves through more than just 2 of the reports that explicitly discuss it, but through a lot of other areas as well. And I want to talk about it because it's such a sensitive issue, right? We always say for really trustworthy alliances, if all we do is talk about where we agree, that is a failed summit, right? You actually have to talk about where we have discrepancies, where we have disagreements, so we can either bridge the gap or get out of each other's way. And I want to talk about Taiwan both because it's sensitive, but also because I think there's some real creative responses that we have in here about additional ways that the U.S. and Australia can begin to collaborate to open up more diplomatic, more economic space for Taiwan. I don't assume that everyone has read the entire report at 71 pages other than Lam and myself, but I would like to kind of engage a broader question about what areas does closer collaboration between U.S. and Australia on Taiwan make sense? Where might it be counterproductive? And frankly, where is it just too politically sensitive to touch? If you don't mind, Mick, I'm going to start with you on this question.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I think there's 2 really important things we need to do here. The most important is we have to assume that a war over Taiwan is possible. This is not something that can be wished away. Assuming it's possible is different from wanting it to happen, of course. And I think there's evidence from a lot of previous wars, including the one in Ukraine, that because people assumed it wasn't possible, they were not prepared. So I think we need to assume it is possible, and that drives, I guess, a more rapid style of thinking and preparation to deter such things. The second thing with Taiwan is it's not actually all about Taiwan. I mean, the Cold War was largely about, the US and the Soviet Union preparing for nuclear war and a war in Central Europe, neither of which ever happened. But lots of other conflicts did during that 4 and a bit decade Cold War. So whilst assuming a war over Taiwan might happen and deterring it is important, we also assume that over the next few decades we might end up in lots of other subsidiary conflicts which we have not yet foreseen and which an over-focus on Taiwan may prevent us from preparing for.
Kelsey?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would add, I think Mick mentioned earlier the China Power report that was released publicly yesterday. There's an estimate in that
China Power report, not by the China Power Center at CSIS, but the China Power report
Yes.
By the Department of Defense. Sorry.
Yes, yes, an annual congressional report that's required.
Congressional,
So DoD, the estimate actually that they released yesterday was that by 2035, China could have 1,500 nuclear weapons, and that is a substantial increase. And so I think, again, if we think about a Taiwan contingency and we think about the potential nuclear escalation risks associated with any kind of a contingency, and making sure that, again, we're having detailed discussions with close allies about, in that type of event, what are the risks of escalation? How do we understand what risks might be escalatory? How do we kind of keep track of who's doing what? Those sorts of detailed discussions, and that's why, again, one of the other recommendations that we make in the report is to really kind of play the long game here too, because I think the broader national security community, I think, has kind of remembered that nuclear weapons still exist, and that there are a lot of really difficult deterrence and, again, kind of escalation dynamics that we need to make sure that we have a cadre of experts who can manage and really think through and be careful about how you approach those types of issues. So one of our recommendations is, again, to kind of play the long game and make sure that you are building a longer kind of talent pipeline of people who understand the broader nuclear threat landscape, but also, again, kind of all of these different dynamics and how they might overlap. So I do think that that's going to be kind of another important piece to make sure that, whether it's kind of a Taiwan contingency in the near term, but also kind of playing that longer term game as well, to make sure that you have the expertise at the table to kind of carefully manage those dynamics, will be really important.
Okay. Matt, you would want to weigh in?
Yeah, I just was going to say, obviously, most of the conversation about Taiwan has been, understandably, about in the military and sort of diplomatic realm, but there is an economic dimension, obviously, to all this. And so let me just first, again, shameless advertising department, say that my colleague, Gerard DePippo, our senior fellow, has done some great work on various aspects of the economics of a Taiwan contingency, including, the implications or the lessons from the Russia-Ukraine sanctions for a China-Taiwan contingency. He did a piece on the sort of economic indicators of a possible Chinese move against Taiwan, what would be the signs in the economic realm. And then last week, with Jude Blanchette, our other colleague, did a fantastic piece on what the economic cost for China would be of even preparing for a war against China, but let alone against Taiwan, but even occupying Taiwan, and the just catastrophic cost this would be for China. So that's one thing, just to advertise that, but also to say, I do think on the more positive side, there's a lot the U.S. and Australia can do to work with Taiwan to give them that economic space, as you said. I don't think any of us are ready for a formal regional trade agreement that includes Taiwan. I just think that's too difficult to pull off because other partners are uncomfortable with doing that with Taiwan and not China. But there are other things that we can do, including APEC. I didn't mention APEC again in my 500-word limitation. I couldn't really get to that.
Matt.
No. But the U.S., I still wrote 600 or 700, I think, and others wrote even more. So, but I didn't get to APEC. U.S. is hosting APEC in 2023. Australia helped co-found APEC. Taiwan is a member of APEC, which is one of the few institutions it is. And there's things we can do in there to promote economic engagement. And I also think we can do things bilaterally, each do bilaterally. Actually don't know, and now I'm caught on camera saying I don't know whether Australia has a trade agreement with Taiwan. I don't think so. We do not, the U.S., but we could do some kind of more formalized bilateral arrangement, which regional partners can have concerns about, but it's our relationship with them. So I think we should pursue things like that bilaterally.
Yeah, no, one of the things I'm thinking of, Lavina Lee, who's a non-resident fellow with the Australia chair as well, she wrote an essay specifically on Taiwan, and all of her second basket of recommendations are absolutely outside of the military space and kind of play up exactly what you're talking about, Matt, in terms of creating more space for Taiwan to enmesh itself into the region, and therefore hoping that Taiwan has more partners in its corner when things get more dicey for it. But Sayan, you guys actually specifically had a recommendation on develop more track 1 and 1.5 bilateral dialogues and trilateral dialogues on the Taiwan contingency. What might that look like?
Yeah, so the reason we included the Taiwan contingency is that South Korea would be watching very closely on how the U.S. would respond in this kind of scenario, especially in the context of increased South Korean concerns over U.S. security, nuclear deterrence commitments, especially in the previous U.S. administration. At the same time, to be realistic, I think Japan and Australia will still be the most important allies in terms of military operations. And in this circumstance, the concern would be that North Korea might take advantage and start conducting provocations on the Korean Peninsula, in which case the U.S. ROK ally response should be to focus on the peninsula. At the same time, it's really important to include South Korea in these discussions, even if it's just for reassurance.
Great. Look, before we break, I do really want to ask you all to get a little bit more pointed and specific about next week and what you might be looking for. Look, when in our essay on development interoperability, which I love the juxtaposition of those two words put together, that Bridie Rice, who's a non-resident fellow here, put forward, she wrote that clarity is needed about the ambition for cooperation. Of course, she writes, this sounds dangerously like yet more talk, but bureaucracies must be clear on the goalposts. And I really like that phrase, the ambition for cooperation. And I was hoping I might ask all of you to conclude with a final thought or two about what you actually think might make next Tuesday, the Ausmin conference, a particularly significant meeting. Obviously beyond incorporating wholesale all 70 recommendations that CSIS has put forward, but what are you looking for when we see this meeting? Sayan, would you mind starting us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're excited to see just a more deliberate, coordinated inclusion of South Korea in U.S. Australia policy and coordination efforts. It's really a unique circumstance for South Korea where capabilities, foreign policy intentions, and also public opinion are really all aligned to help support South Korea play a greater role in the region and with the U.S. and Australia. So looking forward to seeing South Korea sort of feature more prominently in those discussions.
An unsurprising conclusion coming from Korea chair, but a really necessary and welcome one. Matt.
Well, same vein. I would say, look, I know that the Ausmin is more about sort of traditional security-related issues, but I do think, as I said, the U.S. and Australia are critical economic partners, and it really is at the heart of our alliance, our economic cooperation. And so I think it would be good, if the four ministers could say something tangible about their desire to work together particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, on upholding and updating the economic rules of the region. There is a lot of work to be done, and I think they should speak to that.
If Ausmin were written today, it would have economic cooperation at the heart of it. Nick.
Thanks, Charles. I think there's three things I'd look at. Firstly, sense of urgency. In some respects, it's time for action. We've been talking for a long time. Secondly, the ability to take more risk. I think government bureaucracies are used to slow-moving discussions. I think we've got to take more risk in the kind of activity we take. And I think budgets need to change. For Australia and the United States, our defence budgets are going up by small amounts each year, but if you look to people like the Japanese who are making fairly significant investments and big decisions, like we saw yesterday with 500 Tomahawks and things like that, I think we really need to have a look at how much we're willing to commit of our national treasure to deterring what would be a catastrophic conflict in the Western Pacific.
That was 2. Was there a third one that you had said?
Risk.
Yeah, sorry, sense of urgency, risk and
risk.
budget.
Oh, okay, I miscounted. Thank you both for correcting me. Kelsey.
So I think one thing that we'll be paying attention to, particularly on nuclear issues, I think there has been a tendency in the past in Ausmin's statements that have been released to have 1 or 2 sentences on kind of a very narrow counterproliferation issue that's kind of vaguely worded. But I think next week is a good opportunity where I hope we will see at that SecDef and Secretary of State level, much more of an emphasis to kind of cut to the chase and be much more blunt about the seriousness of the nuclear threat environment, certainly, but also, again, making sure that, yes, the kind of the trilateral AUKUS piece is important, but making sure that the specific details for that arrangement, that we don't lose sight of some of those broader long-term deterrence and escalation issues as well.
Well, thank you. I mean, we'll all be ready on Tuesday to see what the outcomes are. Look, as we wrap here, let me actually start by thanking the 4 of you for not only writing terrific essays, but for giving us your time here. I think especially to Mick, who's in Brisbane, and it's now 6 a.m. over there. So thank you. We all owe you a coffee, I think. But I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the fact that we have more than 4 authors here. We have 22 authors. It really showcases, I think, what a broad-ranging collection of expertise we have here. And so all the authors who contributed their time, I'd really like to thank you for giving us such a robust report. I'm sure as we close, I just want to say that for anyone who shepherds forward projects like this, you know that it is really a group effort. And so I want to just thank the CSIS teams in publications who worked overtime and at rapid speed, communications who were there with us the entire way through, and the events team who's broadcasting this to you. We couldn't have done this without them. And then finally, I just do have to thank not only our interns, but especially Lam, who works in our program. You can't see her all. She's off stage left, but this report wouldn't have been done without her and with her attention to detail. So again, thanks very much, everyone, for tuning in. Please go to the website, download, read the report, and then we can match it up against what we actually see next week. Thank you.